Welcome to Mutual Exchange Radio, a project of the Center for a Stateless Society.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to a new episode, actually the first roundtable for Mutual Exchange Radio. We haven't been with y'all for a few months, and a lot of things have happened, to say the least. So we wanted to touch base with y'all and go over a lot of the recent events, some of the things we can think about doing now and in the future. And we have various guests with us to discuss and share their ideas. I'll just introduce myself first. I'm Corey. I'm sometimes host of Mutual Exchange Radio, host of The Long Library. I run C4SS's social media, other various odds and ends. And we also have with us.
Hi, everyone. I'm Alex McHugh. Used to host a lot of Mutual Exchange Radio, but I haven't been doing that for a while. I haven't been doing much of anything with C4SS for the past couple of months to 6 months. Basically, I was really burned out and focused on some other stuff, but trying to get back into it. And what I'll be focusing on today is sort of how do we respond to, increasingly dangerous fascism in the U.S. government. Specifically, we're going to be focusing around immigration today. And so I'll be talking about, what you can do right now, what efforts have already been in place for a while, and you can just sort of plug into.
And I'm Nathan Goodman. I have been writing for the Center for a Stateless Society for quite a while, starting in 2012, but I haven't written for C4SS for quite a while because I had a bit of a career shift where I went into academia, which is where I still do the bulk of my work. And so in addition to my work with the center, I earned my PhD a few years ago in economics from George Mason University. I work as a senior fellow at the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. And a large portion of my research focuses on the militarization of U.S. border security efforts, which I seek to explain through the lens of public choice economics. So the main reason I'm here is to place some of the very disturbing immigration policies and immigration enforcement actions we've seen lately into their broader historical and institutional context and show what some of the academic research on the history, dynamics, and institutional features of immigration policy and border militarization can tell us about the present. So thanks very much for having me.
Zachary Woodman. I am the podcast coordinator, still technically for C4SS. You might recognize my voice. I used to host Mutual Exchange Radio back in the early years. I've taken a step back for personal reasons, but the current state of the world is so egregious and dangerous that I feel I have something like a moral duty to get back into some sort of role with the center and speak out against some of the fascism that we see going on.
Great. Thanks, everyone, for being here and joining us. This is an important episode, kind of touching base and talking about the important recent events and sort of letting everyone know we're still out there and we're still fighting and we're still figuring out ways to engage with what's going on. So I think to get us started then, it kind of makes sense to go over what's been going on the last few months. I think Zach has done a lot of great research and maybe can give us a kind of overview.
Yeah, so basically I'm going to be talking about what the Trump administration has been doing up to this morning. We're recording this on Saturday the 29th. And basically every single time, as you might know, we look at our phones these days, there's some new atrocity being committed by the Trump administration, specifically on immigration, which is, what I'll be focusing on today. I'm not going to mince words. What the Trump administration is doing on immigration amounts to a series of increasingly unconstitutional, inhumane, sadistic, and straight up fascistic acts of cruelty and tyranny. I guess the first thing I'll touch on, it wasn't the first thing they did, was that the Trump administration issued an executive order claiming that they could deport any non-citizen from the country without due process under the Alien Enemies Act. This is the same law that was invoked during the Roosevelt administration to start the Japanese internment camps. So, we're harking back to some of America's darkest, most fascistic history there. And they claim that all they are targeting are members of the Tren de Rega gang, the way they claim that this gang is a terrorist threat to the U.S., that they're bringing drugs and so on and so forth, and basically treating them as like enemy combatants within the U.S. under wartime law. They don't actually have any evidence that Tren Aragua is actually causing, mass problems in the U.S. But evidence doesn't matter with these people, and many of the people they are deporting seem to have no affiliation with this gang. And the administration has provided no evidence from any of them that they have any criminal record in the U.S. or affiliation with this gang. Just this week, a Bush-appointed judge in Virginia ordered the release of a Venezuelan couple who were being detained under this, claiming the administration was producing no evidence that this couple was affiliated with the gang. And, since most immigration is a civil case, this was a civil case. But the judge basically claimed if this were a criminal case and these were warrants for arrest, they would have been thrown out of the court. But most who are being detained under this ridiculous abuse of executive power are not so lucky. One judge has remarked that Nazis got more due process under the Alien Enemies Act than the Trump administration is currently giving migrants. Many have experienced, unlike that Venezuelan couple in Virginia, no due process at all given to them. Some are being deported on the basis of just having tattoos, claiming that just because they have tattoos, they must be affiliated with the gang, as if this is, Japan and we're dealing with the Yakuza or something. And their tattoos, of course, often have nothing actually to do with the gang. There was one instance where a man was extradited to El Salvador, I believe, on the basis of a tattoo he had that was like a cross for autism awareness because he had a brother who was autistic. Real dangerous gang banging stuff there, I guess. Courts are not taking this completely lying down. So district courts have ruled that Trump's attempt to invoke the Alien Enemies Act against non-citizens is unconstitutional. Courts have long ruled that non-citizens have, constitutional rights under the 4th and 5th Amendment to due process. There was, it says in the Constitution, all persons in the U.S., all persons subject to the law, to the jurisdiction of the U.S. have these rights. Elsewhere, the Constitution does distinguish between persons and citizens, like when it talks about voting rights, does not do that with respect to basic civil liberties such as due process. So there's very little reason legally to think that the Trump administration has any authority to extradite these people with no due process. But that hasn't mattered. The Trump administration is trying to appeal it to the Supreme Court. They have defied court orders to release people and kept them because this is essentially a lawless dictatorship at this point. Their legal defense in court has been, well, Trump has a right to extradite people without due process because he has an electoral mandate to deport people on because he was elected by the popular vote, which, in addition to not even pretending to be a constitutional argument or a legal argument for what he's doing, an absurd, like fascistic populist rhetoric that is now masquerading as legal defense. And is just like not fact-based. He won with only 51% of the vote in a low turnout election, and popular mandates are a myth anyways, but I digress. And the right's response to this, besides appealing it and the Trump administration defying court orders at times, we have Speaker Mike Johnson, who's trying to dissolve an entire district court for ruling against Trump on these matters. We have several of these judges have gotten death threats from members of Trump's fascist mob and the general public. In one case, the Trump administration sent a terrifying letter to a law clinic at Northwestern's law school, where they specialize in trying to help migrants, basically threatening their law clinic with retributive action. So they're trying to strip away the ability of migrants to access like legal defenses, in addition to just straight up denying them due process. When Tom Homan was asked about this on ABC, the lack of due process of his immigrants, his response was simply rhetorically, well, what was Lincoln Riley's due process? Referring to a woman in Georgia who was murdered by an undocumented migrant. So basically the administration is just admitting that they're no better than the common murderer and the way they're treating these people. And it's not just illegal immigrants who are being targeted. Many people who are being targeted by the administration are here completely legally. Other policies, the Trump administration is just straight up revoking legal status under very questionable means, including hundreds and thousands of migrant refugees from Latin America who are allowed under the Biden administration that they've just revoked their legal status by fiat. They're pausing green card applications, and some of the people who are being targeted by ICE for extradition are legal. There was a Filipino woman who was coming back from the Philippines, from Washington, I believe, who has been taken into detainment and her family doesn't know where she is by ICE, who has been here for 50 years on a permanent resident card. There was a Cuban man who was here on political asylum, who has been extradited to El Salvador with no due process, who was here legally. And then there's people who are like not trying to come here permanently. They're just trying to come here for travel from places like Germany, the UK, and Canada, who have been detained for weeks at the border, which has caused the UK, Germany, and Canada all to issue travel warnings for the US to the US, as if the US is like some third world dictatorship. And probably the most egregious examples of them targeting college students who've done nothing more than exercise their First Amendment rights to criticize the US's policy, particularly on Palestine. The administration has hunted down a Columbia student for protesting Palestinians. There was a Tufts student who I believe was Turkish. There's a video of her being disappeared by police, or probably ICE agents actually, but it's unclear because they are in an unmarked clothing and van, forcibly kidnapped by them. Again, this is the sort of thing that you see out of a place like North Korea or the Soviet Union with the KGB. It's gotten to the point that I'm just referring to ICE as America's Gestapo because of these tactics. There was Mohammed Khalil, a 21-year-old migrant who has been detained simply for being critical of the U.S.'s stance on Israel. Just the morning we were recording this, the Trump administration sent an email to hundreds of migrants who are here on student visas, announcing that their visas are hereby revoked for their criticism of the U.S. on relationships with Israel and Palestine. They're detaining and extraditing people who are here legally for being political dissidents. Like, let's call it what it is. It's a fascist attempt to violate people's rights simply for speaking out against the administration's policies. And once they get detained, they're being held in inhumane conditions. If you remember Guantanamo Bay from the Bush era, that has now been reactivated as effectively a concentration camp for illegal immigrants. And some of them probably illegal immigrants as well.
Hi, this is Zachary Woodman from the editor's room. Listening back to this, I don't feel like I spent enough time emphasizing just how cruel the treatment of some of these migrants in these facilities are. So just to give you a taste, I'm going to now read a legal declaration of one of these migrants, Luis Alberto Castillo Rivera. As much in its entirety as I can on this show, you can find a link to it in the show notes. I will warn you, this is a little disturbing. If you'd like to skip this part, you can skip ahead to timestamp 2008 for the rest of the panel. But, quote, I, Luis Alberto Castillo Rivera, hereby declare under penalty of perjury pursuant to 28 U.S.C. subsection 1746 the following is true and correct. 1. I make this declaration based on my own personal knowledge, and if called to testify, I could and would do so competently and truthfully to these matters. 2. My name is Luis Alberto Castillo Rivera. I am 30 years old and from Venezuela. I am a plaintiff in Las Americas v. NOM. I joined that case to seek access to attorneys while I was detained at the U.S. military base at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. I entered the United States on January 19th, 2025 with a CBP-1 appointment. Despite following the legal procedures and having a family in the United States, I was detained and never given a chance to see a judge or present my asylum case. I was detained at El Paso Processing Center for barely 2 weeks and did not get to fight my case. 4. The night of January 3rd, 2025, while I was praying, my name was called and I was told to pack my things. I called my wife and I thought I was being released. Instead, I was transferred with 9 other people onto a military plane. Before boarding, officers took multiple photos of us, focusing on our tattoos. 5. I was not told where we were going, just that we were going to be transferred to another prison before being deported. As I learned much later, during the one and only time I got to talk to a lawyer while detained, I was taken to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, and held in a prison known as Camp 6. 6. Each of the people in Camp 6 were held in a very small cell with no windows. The cells were almost entirely enclosed wall to wall, except a piece of glass on the door to see into the building. My cell contained a thin mattress, a blanket, sink, and toilet. It felt like a basement. Military officers guarded us at all times. 7. The conditions at Guantanamo were unbearable. Within the first 3 days, we began a hunger strike, in part because the food was inedible and made many of us sick, and in part because we wanted to receive more information from the ICE officers about why we were being held in these conditions. After our strike, the meal slightly improved, but it was still insufficient, and we were all hungry. We were all told that because more detainees were arriving, there was less food for everyone. I ended up losing a significant amount of weight over the 2 weeks I was detained at Guantanamo. I am much skinnier now than when I arrived at Guantanamo. 8. When I was detained in Texas, I was never placed into solitary confinement. I was able to move freely within the dormitory. I was able to go out to the yard to play sports with other detainees. I was able to use tablets to speak with my family, and I was able to pray freely. At Guantanamo, we were locked in our cells for at least 23 hours a day, with only 1 hour every couple days, quote, outside for, quote, recreation. Even during that time, each person was put into a cage within a larger cage inside an enclosed area. This was the closest to seeing the sun we would get. We were not allowed to interact with one another, even during, quote, recreation. In our cells, we had to try shouting through the doors to communicate. And even the guards would forcefully hit the doors or talk over us very loudly so we could not hear one another. 9. Anytime we left our cells, we were always shackled. 3 guards would enter the cell, push us against the wall, pat us down, and place chains on our hands before leading us out. They would do a pat-down search on us every time we showered. 10. It was very hot outside the building during the day. There were lots of mosquitoes, and the light was constantly on. Because we were not fed enough or allowed to do anything, we lost track of time. It felt like hell, being isolated from the world and stuck in those conditions. 11. The medical care was grossly inadequate, which was frightening because if any of us had a serious medical issue, there would be no real help. I have a leg injury from a motorcycle accident that is not fully healed. I have an abscess in my gluteal muscles that has previously caused me significant pain, swelling, and bleeding. I was previously told I needed surgery. When I was detained in El Paso, my injury was not bothering me so much because I was able to move freely to stretch and walk around. But in Guantanamo, when I was held in a cell for 23 hours a day, my injury began to swell and became very painful. When I asked for treatment, they said they did not have the right tools to help me and they were waiting for those tools. Later, I asked again for treatment. They told me there was nothing they could do for me besides offer a topical cream, which was very frustrating because they previously told me they were waiting on appropriate tools to provide adequate treatment. 12. The guards were needlessly cruel. When we asked for necessities, they would mock us and say it was not possible. It took multiple requests before they returned a Bible I had brought with me. I also repeatedly asked to speak with an ICE officer, but the military guards told me that ICE was not available and would come later. 13. I even witnessed physical violence against other detainees. One man, who he called El Enano, was beaten by an officer for refusing to return a toothbrush. The officer hit him hard on his hand with a radio. I believe his hand was fractured, but I do not know if he received medical treatment. For 2 days after the incident with the radio, the guards would not give El Enano water to drink. Several times he asked for water, and I even asked the guards to give him water as well, but the guards would just laugh and refuse the request. 14. I was denied any communication with the outside world. I asked multiple times to speak with my attorney and my family. After my one call on February 17th with the American Civil Liberties Union, I knew I had attorneys working on my case and trying to help me, but I was told it was not possible to make a call. I also begged the officers to speak with my family. My wife lives in the United States with our 9-year-old son. I told the officers, you must have a family. You must have a child, and I asked them to have some compassion. All I could say is it was not possible to make calls. 15. The night of February 19th, officials slipped a piece of paper under our doors informing us of our right to an attorney and providing a phone number. However, they did not tell us the matter. Told us it did not matter because we would be deported soon, and there was nothing we could do. 16. Just hours later, at 3 a.m. on February 20th, we were taken from our cells, shackled, and loaded on our deportation flight to Venezuela via Honduras. One man asked for his passport back, but while they returned his other possessions, they refused to give him his passport, saying they would send it later. 17. Compared to where I was previously detained in the United States, the conditions at Guantanamo were much worse. In El Paso, I was held in a larger area with 80 other detainees of different nationalities. We were not isolated, and we had access to things like chess, soap, daily showers, and electronic tablets we could use to communicate with the outside world. At Guantanamo, we were treated like animals and terrorists. 18. My detention at Guantanamo changed me. The isolation, the deprivation, the denial of legal help and medical care. It broke us down. We are asylum seekers, not criminals, yet we were treated as if we were dangerous. We are fathers, we have families, and we are humans, yet the U.S. government took us to a military base, cut us off from the world, and deported us without allowing us to fight for our rights. 19. What happened at Guantanamo was inhumane. No one should be subjected to this kind of treatment. 20. Because I am currently in transit through Venezuela and without stable internet connection, I could not sign this declaration myself, but give consent to Talia Roma to sign on my behalf. Executed on 27th February 2025. Now back to the panel.
The most famous one is a mega prison in El Salvador where there are thousands of migrants being detained. This week, DHS Secretary Kristi Noem appeared in a video in front of, several hundred migrants in a cage behind her. Looked like they had been freshly shaved, all of them, and gave this threatening message saying, "This is what happens if you come here illegally." So she's basically using people who are being inhumanely detained as propaganda to threaten would-be migrants. By the way, that is something that would violate the Geneva Conventions. There is the Miami Herald reports there's a detention center, the Chrome Detention Center in Miami, where people are being treated like animals. The reports are they're being treated worse than pets. Over 70 people in this detention center with only 2 toilets, no temperature control. They're being denied water. This is the sort of thing we saw in the first Trump administration. It's just now being greatly expanded. So these are massive violations of, human rights happening at a mass scale with no due process, targeting political dissidents. We need to call this what it is. It's a fascist dictatorship extending its power and ramping up to an ethnic cleansing campaign. That's what it is.
Yeah, if I can jump in, Chrome is the one that I've been paying most attention to. There's been, I think, 3 deaths directly attributable to dehydration already. That number, of course, is going to rise. One of the things I think really shows the lie of this claim that it's about these gangs, it's about, people who are connected to the gang world or whatever, is the plans to build many, many more detention centers, right? And one of them actually was announced recently. They're going to be building a large one here in Michigan. I think that's going to be something very new to those of us who have been part of immigration action for a long time, as we're used to focusing on the southern border. And it's increasingly the case that both borders are being targeted for this kind of action. There's increasing policing of the Canadian border and exploitation of the fact that ICE's range basically, so that they're allowed to do, ICE is allowed to do a lot of things internally. Border Patrol has, I believe I don't remember, it's 100 miles.
100 miles of the border, which would include the entire state of Michigan, the entire state of Florida.
Entire state of Michigan, entire state of Florida. I was talking to Eric recently, most of Maine. These borders are going to become militarized in the way we saw in the state.
To be clear, it's a 100-mile line where the CBP has the right to, stop people without a warrant or anything within 100 miles within the border.
So part of how I found out about this detention center being built soon in Michigan, one of the things I've been looking into is ICE contractors, trying to figure out who serves contracts for ICE and CBP. So that's something I'll talk about more a little bit later. But I also just wanted to note that the perspective from countries outside the US, actually it's been good to see they're recognizing it for what it is. I listen to a lot of BBC, and one of the things that they're talking about, one of the things that they are constantly reminding their listenership and their readership is that our Justice Department doesn't have an enforcement arm. And so legal cases are well and good, but keep in mind that, just because a judge said X, Y, or Z doesn't necessarily mean anything if executive agencies decide to defy those rulings.
Right, and that's something that I think a lot of centrists are not adjusting to. This is not a normal case of an administration having a political agenda that, they'll just back when the courts happen. This is an active fascist assault on our democracy, and they're not following court orders, not following the law at all. And they're not even making good faith arguments in court, as you can clearly see.
Yeah, on the subject of the legal cases, the 2 things I thought were kind of interesting. So this was happening at the district court level, and I didn't do quite as much research as you did, Zach, but one of the judges who was arguing for the Trump administration, this is Judge Justin Walker, was making reference to this gang, Tren de Aruga, and also making reference to the foreign relations function of the executive with regard to agreements that have been made around dealing with this gang between the US government and the Venezuelan government, as well as several other South American governments. And I think we're going to start to see really similar arguments around some of the actions that have happened for some of the things that have happened to people who are criticizing Israel and advocating for Palestine. We're going to start to see foreign policy arguments. So essentially, what these judges are saying is the executive has a right to do things which violate sort of internal domestic law if it serves some more important foreign policy purpose, specifically security threats, right? And so they're saying that this gang is a significant enough security threat that it warrants this. And I believe that's probably the same arguments they're going to use when some of these Palestine and Israel related cases end up in higher courts.
It is quite literally tyranny coming on. Like, before we pivot to Nathan, I also wanted to mention the ridiculous court cases involving the Trump administration trying to basically repeal the 14th Amendment by executive fiat. First day Trump was in office, he signed an executive order trying to get rid of birthright citizenship. And the Trump administration is trying to argue in court that somehow the plain text of the 14th Amendment doesn't apply to non-citizens who have kids here. It says all persons born on the U.S. or natural soil are naturalized. It doesn't say anything about citizens or non-citizens. It does, again, elsewhere in the Constitution. The Trump administration's argument is supposed to be that the people who are born, or the people who are having kids here, the people who are born here, are not subject to the jurisdiction of the U.S. government, which is facially absurd. They obviously can have, police arrest them for violating U.S. law on U.S. soil. So yeah, we also have, the Trump administration acting like a dictatorship, trying to repeal entire executive amendments to take away citizenship rights from thousands of millions of people by executive fiat.
And I also just want to jump in and note, like all of this barrage of assaults on various liberties and rights and all these different directions and layers of all these things. I mean, it's kind of intentional, obviously, as a lot of people have pointed out. I mean, feeling burned out and exhausted and not being able to keep up with it is kind of the point, and it's very useful and embedded in these more straightforward attacks on people's various rights and liberties. So I just want to extend some gratitude to Zach for taking on the psychic cost of collating a lot of these central things and making a bullet list for our listeners to maybe try to keep up with a lot of the big things that are going on without becoming completely exhausted.
Yeah, and we will have a link to like everything that I talked about, the sources that I talked about in the description of the show on C4SS's website.
And I think a big part of this too is appreciating and kind of not forgetting that, not acting like history just started 3 months ago, and like there was build up to this. There's a past. There's necessary events that happened that are important to understand. And with that, I think it's important that we turn to Nathan Goodman, who kind of has a lot to say that might be insightful here. Nathan, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, Corey. So, as Zach said, we're dealing with a situation that is quite literally an instance of tyranny coming home. This is an allusion to a book by my colleagues Chris Coyne and Abigail Hall called Tyranny Comes Home, The Domestic Fate of U.S. Militarism. The basic point here is that governments are, to an extent, only capable of doing the things that their citizenry and the judges and others who pose threats on them will tolerate, right? And we have, for a very long time, given governments a greater degree of leeway when we, one, think they're dealing with foreigners, and two, when we think they're dealing with issues of national security. And so that means that states have broad leeway to experiment with state control in their foreign policy and to engage in more domestic experimentation with state control when they are doing so in the name of national security. So Coyne and Hall identify multiple channels by which experimentation abroad with various forms of state control leads to the cultivation of skills and mindsets related to engaging in coercion. So for instance, they document how the people who started the first SWAT teams in the United States and thereby militarized the police were veterans of various foreign wars, how the establishment of the US surveillance state was largely a result of actions taken to surveil Filipinos when the US was occupying the Philippines, and so on, right? As well as how hardware gets transferred, right? So the militarization of the police is largely a result of the 1033 program, which transfers military hardware to domestic police. And we've seen similar processes happen for border security, right? And for immigration enforcement. And we've also seen that the US tries to frame immigration enforcement as a national security issue so that they can get this broad deference and this broader scope of authority than would ordinarily be tolerated in a more domestic-oriented context. So we've already mentioned some of the ways that this broader leeway to exercise discretionary power has been granted. So the 100-mile zone around the border, and that includes coastlines, by the way. So huge amounts of the US population live in areas where the Border Patrol has the power to stop you and search you, demand to inspect your papers, to see inside your car, and so on, detain you, right, without needing due process or a warrant, right? So that's a deeply concerning situation. And we're also seeing the militarization of the of ICE as well, right, along similar margins. Zach, did you have something you wanted to on here?
Right, it's 2/3 of this population that lives within
Yeah.
that zone.
Yeah.
So the majority of Americans live in an area where CBP can violate their rights fundamentally.
Exactly. And so this is a situation that should be deeply disturbing to everybody, even if for whatever reason you don't know or care about someone who is here as an immigrant. You have good reasons to be worried about your liberties and the liberties of people you care about being undermined by these broad powers. This doesn't just include the search and seizure powers there, right? I mentioned SWAT teams. Well, the Border Patrol has its own top SWAT team. It's called the Border Patrol Tactical Unit. It was established in the 1980s to respond to riots in INS, or Immigration and Naturalization Service facilities. And BORTAC, the Border Patrol Tactical Unit, has been used for a variety of purposes, including in the last Trump administration. They went to Portland, Oregon, to aid the Federal Protective Service in protecting a federal courthouse from protesters who were protesting in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, right? And so in scenes that looked very similar to what we saw recently at Tufts University, although the Tufts situation was ICE rather than the Border Patrol, in 2020, the Border Patrol Tactical Unit was on the streets of Portland in hoodies, dragging protesters into unmarked vans, right? So we see this utilization of militarized police capabilities to attack those who will engage in political dissent, right? So we're seeing it right now in terms of completely stripping away immigration status from illegal residents, stripping their immigration status away so that people can police political dissenters. We saw it last time in the use of the Border Patrol Tactical Unit to engage in brutal intimidation and incarceration and jailing of protesters who were protesting police brutality. We've also seen it in how CBP uses drones. So drones, or unmanned aerial vehicles, have been given to the Border Patrol to surveil both the northern and southern US border. This has been analyzed by Matthew Feeney and David Beer of the Cato Institute. They found that this was as of 2018 when they wrote on this. They found that in the years they studied, CBP's Predator drones had contributed to less than 1% of illegal border crosser apprehensions and cost about $32,000 per arrest that was facilitated. But CBP was also lending these to state and local law enforcement to be used in things that had nothing to do with border security or immigration enforcement, right? So everything from a use in 2011 when police in North Dakota requested to use a CBP Predator drone to arrest somebody over essentially a livestock issue. It's been used to surveil Black Lives Matter protesters in the wake of the killing of George Floyd. Drones have been used to surveil indigenous and environmentalist activists who were protesting oil pipeline construction. And so we see here direct implication of fundamental civil liberties, including the right to protest, right? And so the powers that you grant the Border Patrol, the powers that you grant ICE, are discretionary powers that can undermine very fundamental civil liberties. This process of militarization has been going on since at least the 1970s, right? Timothy J. Dunn, a sociologist, has an excellent book on this. Rhys Jones, a geographer, has a good book on the police powers obtained by the Border Patrol called Nobody is Protected, how the Border Patrol became the most dangerous police force in the United States. And even if we look further back, we see the use of immigration related authorities and deportations and threats thereof to target political dissenters, right? So Kenyon Zimmer, who is a historian, has done a lot on the deportations of socialists and anarchists as part of the first Red Scare. And so chances are, if you're listening to this podcast, and if you're familiar with who we are at the Center for a Stateless Society, you likely have at least some political views that the United States government does not like. And you should be concerned when the United States government consolidates power in a manner that gives them greater and greater coercive abilities to crack down on political dissent. So I think that everybody should be very concerned about the kinds of powers that both the Border Patrol and ICE, both of which are housed within the Department of Homeland Security, are obtaining. And we should be also concerned about the kind of rhetoric that's being used to justify it, because governments are very good at expanding their power using fear, using the perception of a crisis. So when they try and claim that gang violence constitutes a crisis that justifies substantial expansions of political authority, we've seen that type of thing before. We saw it with the war on drugs in the 1980s, and that was the justification for allowing more military collaboration with the Border Patrol and the Immigration and Naturalization Service, which is part of how we got the militarization we see today. We saw it with the war on terror, which led to both increased militarization of immigration enforcement, the establishment of the Department of Homeland Security that ICE and Customs and Border Protection are now part of, as well as, the detention of people without due process at Guantanamo Bay, the dramatic expansion of the surveillance state. States thrive on crises, and they're trying to manufacture one now so that they can even further consolidate power and undermine basic liberties.
Thank you, Nathan, for your deep insights into the recent past, and how it's sort of led to the moment we're in. I will also link to some of your academic work on this exact topic and related topics. They're of great interest and a relevance, and again, understanding the current moment. So
I just want to highlight one thing, Nathan. So that combines what I talked about and what Nathan talked about. What is going on right now is we have them targeting largely non-citizens without due process. You want to talk about something that can be easily extended to citizens. If you don't have due process, how can you prove that you're a citizen if someone from ICE or whatever would come after you? They're targeting people who are here legally who are non-citizens. So it is a very, very, we're already crossing the Rubicon. It is a very, very short step to go from denying non-citizens due process to denying citizens and everyone due process, including and especially political dissidents, because that seems to be who they're targeting already, because due process is precisely the way you would prove you're a citizen.
Yeah, that was really well put, Zach. I mean, the whole point of denying due process, right, is that you then have no way to prove that you're a citizen. There have already been some cases where citizens were detained and had their documents taken from them.
And before the Trump administration, there's a long history from this, since U.S. citizens have been deported on accident, precisely because the people who are here, legally, and have always been here, are going to be the least likely people to have the papers to prove that they are here legally, right? Many U.S. citizens don't have, a passport. Many of them might not have their birth certificate or social security card on them all the time, right? And which also raises questions about the Trump administration's attempts to take away the right to vote from people who can't prove their citizenship. But that's a whole other topic.
on that note, we've looked at the past, we've looked at this current moment here, and then looking forward, I want to bring Alex back into the conversation as we close our show with the final segment here. Alex, thanks.
Yeah, and so Nathan did an awesome job of talking about some of the more recent historical buildup. But if we take an even further step back into history, right? You look at how fascism came to power in Germany, in Italy, in Spain. We're seeing a lot of very, very similar things, which is that you start with foreign nationals, then you start with documented non-citizens, then it becomes something that citizens have to worry about. And one of the ways that this escalates is there's going to be increasingly more papers that you have to carry, right? So it's no longer the case that your driver's license is good enough. It's now, a lot of people are saying it makes sense to have a passport if you are a citizen, right? And that's going to sort of ratchet up. And one of the things that we can do, one of the very easy things that we can do, is not obey in advance, which is rather than starting to carry those things with you because you go, okay, at least I'm going to be safe, recognize that those things are not going to keep you safe. There's always going to be another level that's required, and that's by design, right? So a lot of thought goes into this. There's been fascist governments have been doing fascism for a very long time, right? And so there's a lot of design, right, that's gone into the things that we're seeing now. One of the things Nathan said that I want to just remark on real quick is this increased use of plainclothes officers, plain vehicles, and things like that, which again, historically, there's a huge precedent for this. The reason that you start doing that is not just so that people don't know you're coming, but also because it gives cover to non-agency fascist violence, right? And so I was part of a group of people who, in Philadelphia during the Black Lives Matter protest, recorded and proved the coordination between the Philadelphia Police Department and several neo-Nazi organizations, right? We recorded them talking to each other, coordinating. So this is definitely happening. And one of the things that becomes a lot easier if your agency operatives aren't in uniform and aren't identifying themselves is random neo-Nazis can start doing things that ICE is doing, and who the hell knows the difference, right? So this is that integration of, the modern brown shirts with the agency actions. They're starting to lay the groundwork for that, and I think we're going to start seeing a lot more of that kind of violent activity. So that's one thing that I'm really, really worried about. Obviously, there's a lot of things that I'm really, really worried about. But the good news is there have been people working on this for a very long time. I was saying before we started, I've been a little bit frustrated with liberal friends and relatives recently who are saying, oh my God, fascism's here, what do we do? Because for the past 10 years, a lot of us have been saying fascism is coming, we need to start doing these things now, and have started laying the groundwork for resistance. So there is some groundwork out there. I see a couple things as being particularly useful right now. So there's sort of three categories. One is hitting them in the wallet. So this is how I found out about this detention center that's going to be built soon in Michigan, is I started doing research into which corporations have contracts with ICE and CBP. The bigger ones, there's not really anything we can do about, right? Like your AT&T, your Deloitte. There's no amount of consumer action is going to do anything about that. But there are regional contractors, right? So one of the ones I found was a telecom provider, telecom and data center provider in Colorado called Vound, right? Only operates in Colorado, also provides enterprise software for all sorts of businesses. If people can get businesses to drop those contracts, to stop using those companies, that's going to even slightly delay and reduce the ability of these agencies to do what they're trying to do. And I think that's really the name of the game right now, is we're not going to be able to stop them from doing these things. But to whatever extent we can delay, harass, annoy, put up roadblocks, right? That's the sort of thing that's going to be really useful right now. So one area to look is to start to figure out who in my state is a local contractor, what other businesses are buying their services or working with them. How can we hit those companies in the wallet? If you force local ICE enforcement, local CBP to find a new contractor for their telecom service, that's 8, 10, 12 hours that they're not actively hurting someone. So that's one area that I've been looking at. The other area that I've been looking at is starting to apply the work that's been done in prisoner support and prison abolition to detention centers. They're largely the same thing. There are a lot of groups that have already laid the groundwork for doing prisoner support. Anarchist Black Cross is the one that I've worked with extensively before. And one tactic that's really easy to get involved with that we found to be very useful is pairing up someone on the outside with 1 to 3 people on the inside. And then what you do is, if you're paired up with someone on the inside, right, someone who's incarcerated, whether in a prison or a detention center, you repeatedly call the administration of that prison and detention center and inquire about things that this person needs. So we usually did this around medicine. A lot of people in prisons don't get medical care or medicine that they require. And so what you do is you're paired up with someone who's not getting the meds they need. You call the administration of their prison as many times a day as you can and just say, hi, I'm calling about this inmate, this medicine. Why aren't they getting it? Hi, I'm calling about this inmate, this medicine. Why aren't they getting it? And that does a couple of things, right? It, first of all, just annoys the person who's picking up the phone, right? And so they start to think, okay, if we give this guy his meds, I don't have to screen these, 10, 20 calls a day. The reason you only pair up with like 1 to 3 people is because you have to have a large volume of calls that's very specifically on that person, right? That specificity really helps because it allows the administration to give into your demands more easily, right? If you call and say, I need I'm concerned about every prisoner, they're going to laugh you off the phone, right? That's something that you're not really giving them an easy way to acquiesce to what you're demanding. But if you're calling and saying, hey, this person's not getting enough food, I know because I'm talking to them, right? You have letters going back and forth and things like that. That is really effective. And the last reason that it's really effective is the specificity and the number of calls makes them think a lawyer might get involved. Even if you don't currently or have, if you don't currently have a lawyer involved or have plans to do that, having that specificity makes it a lot more feasible that this could develop into a lawsuit, right? So that's something that we've done a lot with incarcerated folks in prisons. I think it could be useful to start to do with folks in detention centers. Again, it works best around medicine, but I'm starting to think about how we can apply it to things like nutrition, water, other, basic human needs not getting met. Next thing I'll try to get through as quickly as possible, which is documenting and witnessing. So the ACLU has a really good witness hotline set up right now. Really all that means is if ICE or Border Patrol come into your neighborhood, come into your place of work, come into your school, take pictures, take photos, get the agents' names, find out what happened, report that to the ACLU. And there are other groups that are doing witness projects as well. If you don't, you're not going to have individually the ability to build a strong enough case to really do anything. But if enough people report into these sort of centralized witness lines, it's going to make it a lot easier for groups like the ACLU to make their cases. Next one I wanted to talk about is border relief specifically. So people who are in the process of migrating, one of the things that's increasingly happened, they've made it a lot harder to get across the border. A lot more people are dying. A lot more people don't have access to water, for instance, on the southern border. And there's a lot of groups already set up to support migrants in actually getting through the desert and things like that. The two that I feel very comfortable promoting, one is called Borderlands Relief Collective. The other is called Border Kindness or Bondad Frontera. You can find both on Instagram is probably the easiest way to find them. We'll do links for those as well. But really, donations to those kind of groups keep people alive. That goes directly to things like water drops, desert rescues, all of that kind of thing. The other place that is very, very good to donate and start doing, whatever kind of support you can are some of these legal representation organizations. So there's one of these in just about every city. Another that's active, again, along the southern border and so has a little bit more experience in doing these things, has been working for a while, is All Otro Lado, and they are also easiest to find on Instagram. So all of these organizations are really good to support. One thing that I would like to see a lot more of is religious institutions have a history of doing immigrant support as well as starting to hide people, which is something that I think we're going to need to do a lot more of. So if you are someone who's involved in a religious community and your church or your temple or your what have you is not, your mosque is not already doing this, find out what it would take if there's people in your congregations who are down to start doing these things. I know Catholic groups have started doing this a lot in some cities. So if you're, part of that faith, find out what your church is doing. There's a storied history there, and it's going to be increasingly necessary to use the fact that folks on the far right like to claim to have respect for religious freedom and religious sanctity, right? It looks really bad to raid a church. And that's something that I think we can use to our advantage. That being said, there was a Quaker meeting that was raided in the UK last week. So, even that is going to be not as protective as it once was. So I think that's most of what I wanted to talk about in terms of how folks can get directly involved right now, what kind of thing is going to be useful. Oh, the last thing I wanted to say. So in terms of not obeying, in terms of resisting, and the little small things people can do on those fronts, it used to be the case where, if ICE shows up to your work or your school and asks about a certain person, you would say something like, oh, they're not here today, right? Now the answer is, I don't know who you're talking about, right? And if you're someone who is a school administrator, right, and has access to records, if your employment gives you access to things like records of who works there, think about the fact that you have that access and what might be useful to do with it. That's really all I'm going to say about that. But again, every small bit of resistance can be really beneficial, and at this point might save people's lives, right? So I think that's just about everything I want.
With regards to the history of sanctuary, this is something I've been writing about for a bit lately. And so with the sanctuary movement, it really reached its height in the 1980s. You had about 70,000 people across various denominations, Christian, Quaker, Jewish, Unitarian, etc., all doing really important work to shelter migrants, largely Central American asylum seekers during the 1980s. And so, that's not that long ago. It's quite possible that some of our listeners are in religious congregations where that happened within living memory and where you can learn from that historical memory. And a lot of good work grew out of those movements, right? So a lot of the work to offer humanitarian aid at the border that Alex is talking about grew out of people involved in sanctuary movement action. And so I think that's something really worth highlighting. The other thing I wanted to mention is that Tom Homan has expressed significant frustration. He's one of Trump's top immigration officials. He's expressed significant frustration with the amount of know your rights work that people are doing, right? And so, for instance, the National Immigrant Justice Center, the Immigrant Legal Resource Center, for instance, gives out red cards with essentially, or tarjetas rojas, with know your rights information that immigrants can keep on them. You should get some of those cards from them and distribute them in your community. If you can put on a know your rights training, people knowing that, for instance, ICE might present a warrant that isn't signed by a judge and that they don't have to open the door for that type of warrant. That's something that can really be important for protecting people. So that type of know your rights work, I would say, is also really important. So I want to thank Alex for raising so many of the things that can be done, and also to suggest that there's even more to do, and there's a lot that people can do. States are always, to some extent, limited by the resistance that comes from civil society, and we shouldn't let the government steamroll over that capacity for people to pose a limiting factor on their coercive power.
Yeah, if I can just say a couple quick things off of that, the bearing witness is really, really important, and it's important not just because it shows them that we know what they're doing, right? But one of the tactics they're using, right, is they try to keep these things in the shadows, because the more people know about what's actually going on, the more people are going to be willing to resist. I used to do some work in prisons, and one of the things that incarcerated folks said is you'd ask, what do you want us to tell people on the outside? What information do you want us to help get out? And time and again, the thing was just tell them what it looks like, right? These things are built in rural areas. They're built in secluded areas. They're built in places where it's easy for people not to see what's happening. And one of the biggest things we can do, I was saying actually before we started recording, this might be one of the few times when mass demonstration can be really useful. Getting enough people to go out to some of these centers and do demonstrations around them shows people, hey, this is in your backyard. This is what it looks like. And it shows administrators, it shows local government, it shows decision makers. This many people are willing to come out to a rural area and stand around and do a demonstration. And that's the kind of thing that scares them, right? Is getting lots and lots of normal people out demonstrating. That being said, getting a lot of people out to do a demonstration near a detention center that has been built hastily and isn't well put together can be extremely useful. I would encourage people to go back and watch some of the videos of detention center breakouts that happened in Australia earlier in the 2000s, particularly the Woomera detention center breakout. Just go watch that video. It's worth seeing.
So, not to sound like a normie lib, but getting in contact with congressmen can be a way. Like, one thing I mentioned is Congress is trying to overthrow courts, like get rid of district courts that are ruling against Trump on this. And I don't think necessarily like calling and phoning your congressman or phoning and writing your congressman is the way to go, although it certainly can't hurt. But like any town hall events that are going on with local politicians are great opportunities for like the media to report on people are angry about these things. And like get rid of the illusion that, people are just passively going along with authoritarianism this time, which a lot of the elite media is feeding into by, I think, not being as aggressive on the Trump administration as they were the first term.
There's many ways to do something. You get involved in the Center for a Stateless Society. We're always looking for new contributors, new writers, new editors, new researchers. We're here. We're doing something. If you'd like to get involved, let us know. Also, please support us on our Patreon. Check us out on the various platforms like Blue Sky. I want to thank, before we run, I want to thank Alex and Zach and Nathan for sharing your time with us. And I want to thank our listeners for giving us some of your time. I hope our listeners, after this is over, take in everything we said, take a breath, and have a good rest of your day. Check out the next video of ours that'll be coming out soon, where we'll touch base with y'all again. Thank you very much.